record. Michelangelo had a series of assistants who helped him do this, but it was really laborious. And so remember that he gets called back to paint the front altar of the Sistine Chapel for Leo III. So we have a new pope, Pope Leo III. And so this wall took 6 years as the ceiling only took 4. So it actually took him a lot longer to do it. So last class we were talking about how this is in a slightly different placement. Typically, Last Judgments are on portals. So they remind you of, you know, what you're going to, or like the reason you need to be in a church. But this one is on the altar end of the clergy. So this is a chapel made for cardinals, bishops, other people who work within the Vatican, which is quite striking that you would need, hi, yep, occupied. Sorry. So this is a room that's only used by religious leaders. So the general public wouldn't be here. So this is like interesting because you're standing and you're in mass and you are seeing basically the end of the world, right, on the wall, you know, and you get to see hell and you get to see heaven. And so it really speaks a lot to the Counter-Reformation, these kind of monumental large projects to celebrate the beliefs of the Catholic Church. And so you can see how the style basically has changed from about the early Renaissance by Signorelli to Michelangelo's Last Judgment, right? So how does he break up the composition, right? Remember, Michelangelo likes to organize space. So instead of organizing this in an architectural framework like we saw with the Sistine Chapel, he still continues to do monumental groupings. Can you see how he kind of clusters the people together, right? He divides it into half. So Jesus is right in the center, right? And then he has these horizontal bands. So we have the heavens, we have people floating up to the heavens, and then we have the earth and hell on the bottom row. So it's almost like it's in registers. It's not formal registers, it's just kind of like his organizational system. And then vertically, he's organizing it where we have the dead going up to the heavens and the dead going down to hell, right? And so he organized it in a very intentional method, right? So let's go ahead and turn on our audio. How would you characterize Jesus? What does he look like? How would you characterize the body and the depiction of Jesus? First off, what is he doing? What is he doing? What is his arms gesturing? What does that convey? What do the arms of Jesus typically convey in a Last Judgment? We had this at St. Foy. What do you think, Katie?
It has to do with like the people around him, right?
Right. So his arm is up, right? And he is thrusting it forward. What does that convey? Sorry, I'm screaming. Getting through the mask. What is that? What do you think, Jeffrey? You're laughing at me.
Oh, I don't know.
You don't know? That's damning. He's damning you guys to hell. You guys misbehaved. You don't believe in him. You've sinned. So you're going to go to hell, right? And so he is damning those. And he's doing it across his body. So the people going to hell are on his left, our right. And then his other hand is in blessing, right? So his left hand or his right hand is blessing those on the left, right? So it's kind of like the opposite. So it's a little bit more dynamic. What does his body look like? How would you characterize the size of his head to the rest of his body? What do you think, Isabel? It looks, it's way too small. This really does show us what's happening by the late Renaissance into what we call the Manners period. They're no longer concerned with classical proportions. They're all interested in impact, in dramatic impact. And so he's totally out of proportion. He's got an itty bitty little head, and he's got this gigantic Hellenistic body, right? And so those are kind of those characteristics that we typically see in what we call the late Renaissance or the earliest Mannerist period, right? So he is still sort of idealized. He probably has way too many ab muscles. Everything is bulging, right? And so he looks very powerful, right? So an interesting fact is this little guy here, that's a skin, is Saint Bartholomew, and he was skinned for his religious beliefs. Michelangelo actually made that into a self-portrait. So that little head that we see there is actually an image of Michelangelo feeling like he's skinned alive. He's martyring himself, painting a wall when he would rather be sculpting. Right? So in the center of it, we have angels blowing and kind of waking the dead in earth. And it's really interesting to look at some of the facial expressions of these guys. This one here, his eyes are kind of rolled back into his head, and it's kind of got this unsettling sort of feeling to them. But these angels are like super buff. They are bodybuilders, right? Here we have our right side where souls are going up into heaven, and you can see how angels are carrying them up into the heavens. You see the weight of them, right? And then the left side is the damned being dragged to hell. Interesting enough is that when they cleaned it, they started to see some really interesting details, such as a serpent biting the private area of one of these damned guys. Also, the guy who's leading those to hell was a major critic of the style of Michelangelo. He was a bishop who didn't like Michelangelo. He thought that there was too much nudity in the Sistine Chapel and ordered for a lot of the fig leaves to be painted over parts of it. And so when they cleaned it, they restored it and got rid of all those additions. But they found that that looked like this real life person who was basically making Michelangelo's life a living hell. And he's in hell, right? He's depicted in hell. Right? So here we actually see him again, and he also has wrapped, right, and the serpent biting him. Michelangelo definitely had a good sense of humor, right? So here's some examples of his later pieces. The one on the right is from Hellenistic Greece, and so you can see how he was basically inspired by some of the eroticism that he saw there. He went back to Florence and did, this is Santa Croce, which we talked about, or San Lorenzo, excuse me, and he did the new Sanctity. Brunelleschi did the old one, he did the new one, and he did it for the Medici. And so he designed a really beautiful staircase, which just looks like stairs, but normally stairs are just functional rectangular shapes, and he made them curve. He also designed some Medici tombs for the new Sanctity. And so these are two Medicis. And then over the tops of them, he has personifications. And I love this one. This is the personification of night. And so he intentionally made it look unfinished. So that's pixelated, but also it is rough. You don't see all the detail because at nighttime, it's hard to see detail, right? This is on top of Capitoline Hill. This is overlooking the Forum in ancient Rome. He designed this system of the building, so he was an architect. He designed the piazza, and this is where the Marcus Aurelius sculpture is. He put those colossal orders that go multiple levels, just like Alberti did. But you can see how it uses a lot of classical vocabulary of, pediments and pilasters and capitals, post and lintel. He designed the top of St. Peter's. He actually made Bramante's plan. he kind of expanded upon it and made it more sculptural. It had a lot more muscular or beefy, like thickness to walls and details. And basically, the person who finally gets St. Peter's built, Moderano, kept a lot of the style of Michelangelo in it, right? So at the very end of his life, one of the last pieces he was working on was another Pietà. And you can kind of compare the style from his early period to his late period. We won't talk about it because it's not in the 250 and we should move on, but you can see that his style does evolve in his lifetime. He had a very long career. He lived to a very old age. Okay, so we're gonna move, we're still in the high Renaissance, but we're gonna move locations. So instead of being in Rome, we're gonna be focusing on Venice. Am I screaming at you guys? You guys hear me too loud? Okay, because the speaker is kind of close, and I wanna make sure Isabel hears me through my mask. So I just wanna make sure I'm not being obnoxious to you guys. If I ever am because I'm too loud, let me know. I won't take offense. Okay, so we're going to be looking at innovation and experimentation in Venetian painting. Okay, so can anyone tell a major difference between Florentine Roman style, which I should have put on this side. I should have flipped them, I apologize. This is Roman Florentine style, right? This is Venetian style. Can you tell a major difference in the style?
The Venetian one is a lot darker and muted in color.
Right. And the major reason for the big change is the media. The the Florentines and the Roman painters typically worked in fresco. Fresco tends to be very light and very bright with like luminous colors. The Venetians worked in oil paint. Remember that oil paint was very common in the north. Venice, right, was a major trading power. It was a major city. You know, it's kind of a gateway between the east and the west along the Silk Road. Lots of money coming through there. And then, has anyone ever been to Venice? Anyone been to Venice? No? You know from pictures, Venice is very wet. So plaster doesn't work very well in Venice. It takes a long time to dry. There's a lot of humidity. And so the walls don't really hold up very well. And so Venetian painters traded with and collected oil paint from the north and used it as a media. It was much better for their climate. And so what happens is the colors tend to play on the qualities of oil paint. Oil paint is very luminous, but also it does kind of like dull and darken with age. And so it has a lot of kind of browns to it. A lot of these artists also painted what we call it underpainting. So they would paint everything monochromatic in browns, and then they would layer thin colors of paint on top of it. So those reds are overlaid on top of paint to represent the value, either in all grays or all browns. And so they tend to have more like warm kind of characteristics to the tones, right? So this is the early style in Venice. Major artists were like Bernini and Giorgiano. Titian, who was in the 250, actually worked with Giorgiano, probably was his apprentice, right? And so go ahead, because we're going to do this in the Venus, we have the Venus of Urbino. Go ahead and put these characteristics on that page in your note takers. So the reason for, you know, why these things look different with oil paint is that Titian worked in oil paint and he used underpainting. So he's going to be painting everything in value from light to dark, and then he's going to lay thin layers of color on top. That's the glazing component. So he's going to layer thin layers of color on top to create that luminous sort of quality. Sometimes he also painted in impasto. Impasto is the opposite of a glaze. Glaze is thin. Impasto is thick. And so sometimes he would use those thicker paints to create texture. Some art historians have noticed that there's ground up pigment and ground up glass in some of the paint. And we think that he used, well, we know through analysis, he used crushed glass to make them even seem more luminous. And then he typically chose a certain time of day. He really loved the lighting at dusk. I know I personally do too. It's kind of like my favorite time to go out for a walk is when it's about to sunset. It has this really even kind of earthly lighting to it. Leonardo loved this time of day too. And so a lot of Titian's work kind of has the same lighting quality to the work of Leonardo. So, you know, rather than at noon or early morning, it's kind of this sun is setting sort of feel to most of his paintings. So this is a Giorgiano Titian, and Manet, who we will talk about, does an update of this in the 1800s, where he basically is like, why are there nude women picnicking with a bunch of men, right? These guys are the muses. They're supposed to be inspiration for these new players. Manet, he's just making fun of old paintings. We'll talk about him later. He does some altar images, right? And that leads us to our Venus of Urbino. We are going to watch the video for this one because sometimes it's blocked at home on your computers. So we're going to go ahead and watch this. When we're looking at this painting, we're going to focus on the function of it. Why was it made and who was the patron? Obviously pay attention for other things as well, but that's the reason I really want you to, oh, actually, I have it set up, I forgot.
We're in the Uffizi, and we're looking at one of the great Titians, the Venetian master, who is painted here an image which is often referred to as the Venus of Urbino, which is a title that the painting acquired later in its life.
So we don't really know who she is.
Right, and there's not much to convey the idea that she's a Venus except that she's nude. It needs to be a protective title that makes it acceptable subject matter.
Which was often the case in the history of art after this, that one could look at an image of a nude woman and think about ideas of beauty, safe from a sense of improper looking by understanding the figure as Venus instead of a nude woman.
But it's clear that whoever she is, this is a painting that's about sensuality, it's about the sort of the beauty of the physical. She is gazing directly at us with a coyness and a correctness that is really alluring.
It is, and the way that her long, silky hair frames her breasts, and the way that she holds the flowers near her skin, and the sensuality of the sheet and the couch. It feels like a very sensual environment, but mostly the sensuality, I think, emerges because of the incredible softness that we sense from the paint.
So Titian is a Venetian, as we mentioned. He's coming out of this extraordinarily rich tradition. I'm thinking about the work of Bellini and the way in which these artists borrowed from actually the painting of Flanders and brought oil paint to Italy and began to experiment in very sophisticated ways with glazing, creating a softness, as you said, but a richness of color, a visual sensuality, which is a perfect vehicle for the sensuality of the subject matter here.
And by glazing, we're talking about a specific way of applying the paint, where the artist applies very thin layers of oil paint that are almost translucent, one on top of the other. Titian was supposed to have painted up to 10 to 15 layers of paint. And so the figure glows, and there's a softness, her outlines and in the modeling that enhances that sensuality, as you said.
Titian's use of dripstore in combination with that glazing and softness has created this real sense of her flesh. This is central to this painting. We have also Titian setting up this tradition of the reclining nude that will be forgiven for virtually the rest of Western art history. We can certainly think of Manet and lots of people in between. She is creating a kind of soft diagonal kind of curve that moves from the left to the lower right of the canvas, stopped up by pillows.
The canvas itself is divided in two, with a scene taking place in the background, so our eye moves down her body and then to the background.
And those figures in the background on the right really balance the mass of her body on the left without distracting from it, because they are in the distance. And so it's a really successful composition. position.
And like so many other artists later who are going to paint the female nude, there is a little bit of playing fastness with human anatomy here. Her torso is too long.
Her feet are tiny.
Her feet, it's true, her feet are tiny. I hadn't noticed that before. It's funny, that it's not something we notice immediately. What we notice as soon as we look at it is her incredible beauty and sensuality and sexuality. And it's only when we start to really look closely and pay attention that we notice those problems.
So think of all the artists that are looking back to this painting, this kind of painting. I'm thinking about Courbet, we've already mentioned Manet.
And
That's right, so many people who are, this is reinventing what Titian did.
And Titian himself is looking back at a painting by Giorgione. And so this emergence of the female nude as a genre really begins in the Renaissance.
Okay, so what's the subject matter? What is this image supposed to be about? Oops, sorry. What is it about? They ended the video talking about that. Quana, did you hear?
Sorry, the video was like cutting out for me a lot. But is it about the woman in the front?
It is. It is basically about male gaze. The whole function of this is for the Duke of Urbino. So the patron of this is the Duke of Urbino. And this is just for his pleasure. This is probably not his wife. It's probably his mistress, reclining fully nude, right? And it would probably have been kept in his private room. So it was common for men to have kind of their own studies or offices at home. And so it was probably in there or probably in a room where he would meet with other men, not his wife, right? And so images like this become very common in the High Renaissance, and then they exist all the way up to contemporary day. So we're going to see countless images that are very much inspired by Venus of Urbino. So we'll see Manet's Olympia. So the guy who did the men dressed with the nudes at the picnic, we're going to look at his version of this. And so it really is just there for male gaze, right? So dogs, we've seen dogs before. Remember the Arnolfini portrait? What is a dog a symbol of? What's a dog symbol of? Jeffrey, do you know?
Is it like dogs like herd animals, maybe that? I don't know.
No, it's more like what you guys have dogs for at home. They're like man's best friends. They're symbols of fidelity, right? So it's kind of interesting that there's a symbol of fidelity here with a mistress. She's probably, she probably doesn't cheat on him, right? But I think it's kind of interesting that there's a symbol of fidelity with a mistress painting, right? So a lot of this imagery, this is Olympia we'll look at later. This is Manet's version of it. He replaces the dog with a cat to intentionally make a derogatory term. So we're obviously not in tables, but let's think about how he emphasizes her nudity. How does he make it obvious that this is for male gaze? How is her body displayed? Jasmine, what do you think? How's her body displayed?
It's on a diagonal, so it feels like more of her body is exposed to us.
Right, she's like tilted towards us on that diagonal. And notice how she's like up close. Remember that in the Renaissance, they often do that kind of horizontal element in space. And so here we have her in the front, and then we have her servants in the back, right? Anyone know what her servants are getting? They're going through trunks. They're getting her clothes, right? That emphasizes her nudity, right? The fact that she needs clothes. What is she doing? She's looking at the viewer. She's looking at her duke, right? She's making eye contact with him, which is bold. Her hair's cascading down her shoulder, and her other hand, kind of like when we see Greek sculpture, is basically covering her nudity, but also it's also pointing the direction to it and going, hey, she's nude, right? And so he uses this kind of soft, sort of luminous quality of oil paint to make her skin seem smooth and her hair seem textured and how it cascades across. He uses this low light to create this really kind of sexually charged image, right? And so I think we went through all of these. Oh, I forgot jewelry. She's wearing some jewelry to kind of emphasize that she's unclothed as well. But these are the things that emphasize and focus on the function of this painting. So the ideas, once again, of how these are Titian's, how you can tell it's a Titian is he uses oil, he uses those glazes, he uses those bold, rich colors. See how the pops of red, right, stand out. It's got sfumato, so remember that smoky sort of quality of shading like Leonardo. He does that too. And it has asymmetrical composition. Titian really thought carefully about how he organized the space. She's in the front, the servants are in the back, but there's also that wall or curtain kind of separating those two worlds. So it's highly composed as well. Titian, at the end of his career, becomes very, very religious. And so in this later painting, when he was close to his deathbed, very much like Michelangelo, becomes very, very emotional and becomes very like textural. So this is done more in that thick impasto paint rather than the thin glazes. Okay, so that is the end of the High Renaissance. Oh, I hit too many buttons. Oh well. I'll reshare in just a second. So we're going to move from the south. So when we talk about the south, we're talking about Italy, right? We're going to be moving into the Northern Renaissance, or I apologize. We're moving into Mannerism first, and then we'll move to the north. I apologize. So we're going to be looking at the later styles of painting of this late Renaissance, or what we often call Mannerist. Okay, sorry, I'm going to have to unplug here to replug to get my share functions to show back up. Maybe. Okay, should be up and running now. Okay, so we're going to be looking at characteristics of Mannerism. Mannerism is very interesting. It's kind of like looking at that later piece of like the Sistine Chapel with Michelangelo. The theme of Mannerism is called post-PMA, right? So the P stands for the psychological emotion of the artist. So you're going to kind of see the inner vision of the artist becoming a more of a major focus. They seem very otherworldly. So the paintings are kind of ambiguous, and they don't always feel like they exist in reality. Which leads us to the next one, which is strange. And the last characteristic is of today. A lot of work of the Mannerist period and late Renaissance often looks, or often the images are painted looking like people of the current day. So unlike like the School of Athens, where they look like they are all classical, right? Classically dressed. These people are going to be wearing Renaissance attire. So the PMA equals late, right? So PM is late, AM, PM, right? And the A equals anti-Renaissance. So we're going to see a lot of characteristics of the Renaissance disappear. And Mannerism is kind of odd for the sake of being odd. It's kind of a strange period, right? So there are two different styles of Mannerist pieces. We only have the anti-classical in our 250. But I will show you a few of the ones that we call elegant Mannerism, right? This is anti-classical, right? This is the one that is in your 250. So if you want to write down these characteristics now rather than later, feel free. So anti-classical Mannerist happens first, and it has a lack of classical balance to composition. In the Renaissance, artists thought really carefully about where they organized their space. In anti-classical Mannerism, it kind of feels a little bit more haphazard or chaotic. The colors are very bright. Sometimes the lighting is very unusual, and sometimes they'll use strange colors. So we're going to see an image of a green Jesus. He's like neon yellow green. It's kind of an odd thing, right? There's kind of a lack of the ideal form. So you're going to see a lot of distortion, elongation. This image of Jesus, his torso is gigantic. It's like the Michelangelo, the little itty bitty head of Jesus and that big body. Doesn't really jive, doesn't really make sense. We have that psychological emotion of the artist, the inner vision of the artist standing out. The artworks often seem otherworldly. They're still dramatic. These artists were highly skilled. And often when you hear like a lecture or watch a video or discussion on Mannerism, they really talk a lot about how these artists were showing off. They're showing off that they are skilled in fresco or skilled in oil paint. And they're just kind of going to town and, doing too many figures and showing off, their lighting and showing off their technique and doing these kind of strange scenes to really exhibit their skill as an artist. Often the scenes are secondary scenes, so kind of like scenes that weren't as common in subject matter as in the High Renaissance, and the space is often either ambiguous or really shallow. So notice in this painting, like what's the setting? Like where does this take place? We have like a hint of a cloud, but there's like very little background here, okay? Elegant Mannerism was basically what the aristocrats and the uber wealthy wanted. And so a lot of them are portraits of them. They're a lot less dramatic. They're very courtly. The skin is typically really soft and smooth and graceful. They often have very strange proportions. His fingers are really long and skinny. It's very common to kind of stretch out details of fingers or necks or torsos. Things aren't as idealized. Like I said, they're highly skilled, and sometimes they have shallow space as well. So that's kind of like those two sets, right? So we have our one piece of Mannerism is called The Entombment of Christ by Jacopo del Pontomoro, right? So we're going to watch the video for this one as well, and we're going to focus on the subject matter, right? We're going to look at what other imagery is painted in the chapel, right? And then how it is no longer Renaissance.
church of Santa Felicita in Florence. We just walked in the doorway, and immediately to the right is a small burial chapel.
This chapel belonged to the Caponi family, who acquired it in the 1520s.
And they soon hired the artist known as Pontomoro to produce its decorative cycle. And this consists of a large altar painting, 4 rondels, 2 frescoes on the wall that abuts the facade, and a painting in the dome that no longer survives.
The Altarpiece by Pontomoro has long baffled art historians.
The artist seems to have removed all the stage props that are traditional in paintings like this. He's left us instead with the human body and capacious cloth.
And one cloud.
That and a little bit of steep ground are the only hints that place these figures.
But when we look at this painting in the 1520s, we seem to have moved away from the Renaissance. We don't have an illusion of space. We don't have linear perspective or atmospheric perspective. We don't have bodies that seem to be weighted on the ground.
Christ's torso is massive, and yet he seems to be carried with no effort at all by the attendant figure in blue just to his left.
And the figure below him, who's carrying most of his weight, is balanced on his tippy toes.
Absolutely impossible as his anatomy.
Pontomoro was playing fast and loose with human anatomy, something that would have been so important for Renaissance artists.
Look at his neck. Look at the length of his torso. There is an exaggeration that seems to be a kind of rejection of the clarity of high Renaissance naturalism. This painting is often seen as an exemplar of the new Mannerism style, built on the naturalism of the high Renaissance, but introducing a dance-like elegance.
Mannerism is the style that emerges after the High Renaissance in the 1520s.
Unlike High Renaissance painting, which looked to nature as its source, Mannerism and Pontomoro seem to be using art itself as its source. In that way, it's highly self-referential. Pontomoro is looking back to Pietà by Botticelli, a painting that likely influenced Michelangelo in his own rendering of the sculpture, the Pietà. And so although this painting rejects so many of the traditions of the Renaissance, it's also building on those traditions.
Christ's body very much recalls Michelangelo's figure of Christ in the Pietà, but instead of that pyramid composition that has that sense of stability, here the composition takes the form of a circle, which means that our eye never really comes to rest. And in the center, we see a gesture of a figure holding a cloth and some hands holding up one of the hands of Christ. These gestures that are hard to interpret, that occupy the very center of the composition.
Those gestures, though, create an extraordinary sense of elegance, an elegance that we also see in that earlier Botticelli.
And we have an entirely different historical context. We have the beginnings of the Reformation in Northern Europe, but also a new context here in Florence, the dismantling of the Republic and the consolidation of Medici rule, which will lead to the Medicis becoming the Dukes of Florence.
So what is happening here? What is the subject of this painting? Art historians are all over the map.
And that's because sometimes we think about this as a lamentation, that is, Christ's followers grieving over his dead body. Sometimes it's been interpreted as a deposition from the cross, except we don't have a cross and we don't have a ladder. We don't have many of the figures we would normally associate with a deposition. And so what exactly is going on here?
It has been suggested that this is Christ being lowered into the tomb.
The tomb, which would be basically in this very space of the chapel.
Other art historians have suggested that Christ's body is being lifted onto the lap of the Virgin Mary. That is, this is the moment before the Pietà. And still other art historians suggest that perhaps unique in art history, Christ is being lowered onto the table of the altar that exists physically in the small chapel.
Luther had called into question the notion of transubstantiation, a miracle that takes place at every Mass when bread and wine are transformed into the body and blood of Christ. And showing Christ's body being lowered onto the altar is a confirmation of that miracle. Another interpretation is that the figures who look out at us are 2 angels, and they've removed Christ from Mary's lap and are going to elevate his body toward heaven, toward God the Father, who once appeared in the dome above, in a pose perhaps that indicated his welcoming of Christ's body. In that case, this subject would be close to a well-known subject called the Throne of Mercy, where
in isolation, but in a relationship with the fresco that would have been above it.
We've been talking about how its iconography is different than traditional depictions of the lamentation or the deposition. We've been talking about the historical context, and we've been talking about the formal properties of how this painting looks. And we've been looking at the context of the chapel itself to tell us about Pontomoro and this moment in Florentine painting in the 1520s.
Okay, so that first question on the screen, right? What is the subject matter is kind of loaded. The name of this is called the entombment, or excuse me, yeah, the entombment or the deposition, right? I think the 250, they call it an entombment, correct? Yes, the entombment. But everything about this painting is ambiguous, and that is really characteristic of the Mannerist period. So what parts of this tell us that it's an entombment? What did the video say? Like, the entombment is where his body is being placed into the tomb. So what about this suggests that? Raheel, what do you think?
The image is very like condensed and it's very compact.
Right? But what part of it says it's the lowering of the body in the tomb? What's the visual information that describes that?
The two people carrying the person in the front.
Exactly. So we have his body, and they're like feeling the weight of his body, and it feels like they're lowering it into the tomb. However, there's no tomb. We don't have an opening. We don't have anything. So maybe the tomb was in this chapel, right? But it's very ambiguous. It's very characteristic of this. They often say it's the deposition, which is the taking down from the cross, but there's no cross, right? There's no Pietà here with him sitting on her lap. This could be a lamentation, right, with the mourning. We really don't know. And so in AP, often, when they ask you about visual evidence, they might say, what's the function of this? What's some of the different interpretations of that? And you would want to come up with some visual evidence. This is a really good example of that. So you could say, what's the visual evidence of a deposition? What's the evidence of entombment? What's the evidence of lamentation? Let's go with the lamentation. What about this makes it seem like they're mourning his body? Aaron, what do you think?
Sorry, the last part cut off. Could you say the last part again?
What visual evidence supports that this could be a lamentation, that idea that they're mourning Jesus? So we're looking for visual information.
I would say the bright colors, and it looks like in the background, there's blue in the sky as well as clouds.
Right? So it's kind of sorrowful with the blue. But when we look at the Lamentation by Giotto, remember that there's all these reactions of the figures. We have people in different states of mourning. We have people looking at us. We've got all those gestures, the hands, right? It's almost like mudras when we looked at Buddhist or Hindu art. And so there's all of these different elements that really are ambiguous, but you would want to be able to support it with visual evidence, right? So in the chapel, it's not the only painting. What else is included? It was at the very beginning of the video. We have the Annunciation. We have the Gospel writers, right? Why is the Annunciation paired with this altar? What is the story of the Annunciation? We have this on the Marode altarpiece. Remember Campion? Gabriel, Mary. What's happening in the Annunciation? Gabriel's an angel. Why is he coming to see Mary? Emily, what do you think?
I don't really know.
You guys, if you don't know something, look it up. You guys got the internet, right at your fingers. Annunciation is a major story you need to know because it is the subject matter of the Merode Altarpiece. So that's one of those religious facts you need to know because it impacts your understanding of the artwork. Can anyone help her out? Anyone have it on the tip of their tongue?
Yeah, the Annunciation's when they announce like Jesus is going to be born to Mary.
Right. That's where Gabriel tells Mary she's pregnant. She's like, how is that possible? I'm a virgin. Right? So we have a story of the beginning of his life paired with the end. Right? And that's a very common way of organizing imagery to teach doctrine. Right? So how it's no longer characteristic of that late Renaissance. We talked about these characteristics already, so you might have already jotted them down, right? But remember that it's very shallow. Everything's kind of up front. It's ambiguous. We don't have a lot of background, right? There's just that little cloud. We don't have the cross. We don't have the tomb, right? It's got those bright sort of luminous colors to them. It's almost like high contrast. Like when you take a bad photo and the skin is too bright in places, we have elements of that as well. Look how light these highlights are, right? We've got this kind of otherworldly effect. Let's go ahead and zip through a few more examples. This is Parmigiano, like the cheese, Parmigiano. And he did this self-portrait of himself. Look at, he did it in like a convex mirror, so once again, showing off. His most famous piece is called Madonna with the Long Neck. I mean, look at this. She's got a long neck. She is like the epitome of a pear shape. She's narrow, and then she gets really wide. And then look at poor Jesus. Have you ever seen a baby look like that? That's like a bald, like 8-year-old. Just strange. Here's Bronzino. He was really famous for his portraiture. He did a lot of the Medicis and a lot of the like uber elites of the day. This is the green Jesus that I was mentioning. Look at his body. He's like neon green. He's like chartreuse. Here's some totally unrealistic proportions. This is Rossellini. This is real famous. You see this all over the place in Rome, or in Florence, I should say. The little Pooty playing a lute. Sculpture exists too. This is a salt and pepper shaker. We have a personification of the earth. And then the pepper is kept in this Roman, or this temple. And then there's a bowl on the other side with salt. And there we have Neptune or Poseidon, right? Next to the salt. So kind of like over the top, fancy for like no apparent reason. This is Bologna. This is in Florence underneath the loggia at Ponte Vecchio, so like the city hall. So kind of like twisted, contorted. It looks kind of like a Rape of the Sabine, right? And then in architecture, oh golly, I can't believe I forgot his name. Let's see. This is Palladio. Oh my goodness, I can't believe I forgot Palladio. Palladio is known especially in neoclassical. So a lot of American architecture is inspired by Palladio. And this is a church in Venice that he made. And the interesting thing is that makes this kind of like Mannerist is that this is like a facade. This white marble classical temple is like 6 feet thick, and it's like superimposed on top of a structure that doesn't really match it. So notice how the walls are like in brick, but it's not all in marble. So it kind of has this fake sort of quality to it. Probably his best known is called Villa Rotunda. This is a farmhouse on the outskirts of either Verona or Venice. I can't really remember, but it's like one of the water cities in eastern Italy. And so instead of being kind of a modest farmhouse, it's a house inspired by a classical temple, and it has perfect radial symmetry to it. It would be very difficult to kind of live in this house. It has 4 staircases, 4 pediments. It has a dome in the center. It looks identical in all different directions. And so Jefferson, when he designed Monticello, was very much inspired by this. Here's underneath the dome, so classical paintings on the walls, right? So we're going to move into the north, and so we're going to be looking at the Northern Renaissance. So we're going to be focusing on territories of the Holy Roman Empire. Remember that this is different than the Catholic Church. So in the north, we have slightly different characteristics of art. We will still have some Catholic patrons because the Holy Roman Empire was Catholic, okay? We're going to have some new patrons who are Protestant because of Martin Luther and the Reformation. We're going to have a lot of iconoclasm, so a lot of older Catholic artworks that had existed in areas that became Protestant were often destroyed or painted over. And then we also have the emergence of a new art market. Because a lot of art couldn't be painted for religious purposes anymore, artists had to find new patrons. So we have like the rise of portraiture and still life and landscape taking place in the north, right? The first artist that we're going to see is Hieronymus Bosch, and he's not in the 250, but this is such an important piece that we'll take a few moments to look at it. How do you think Hieronymus Bosch felt about contemporary people? I kind of feel like this could be our contemporary society today, to tell you the truth. A lot of hate on the news lately, right? He didn't think very highly of people. He thought of them as kind of like sinful, kind of disgusting and gross. He is very religious. He made a very famous artwork that is at the Prado in Madrid. He was a northern artist, but Spain ruled Northern Europe at this time. And so it makes sense that it ended up in Spain. This is the exterior of an altarpiece called the Garden of Earthly Delights. And so on the closed section of it, it basically is an image of the world. And then when you open up, it is an image of basically Eden and hell. So he's really known for these kind of fantastical creatures and fantastical settings. And so at the very bottom, we have Eve being introduced to Adam. But when you look behind, you have this strange fountain, and we have fantastical creatures or creatures that we might recognize, like this strange looking giraffe or elephant or unicorns. And there's a lot of imagery that is based on real things, but he would have never have really seen them in real life. But also he kind of made up vegetation. So they often feel like they exist in another world. In the center, we basically have sin galore. And there is a lot of erotic imagery where people are fornicating inside fruits. They're fornicating inside bubbles. It's just all the sins of the world personified. And then on the other side, we have these fantastical creatures. Look at these like bird / rodent / human forms that he creates. Quite an imagination. And then on the right side, he basically has, because of all that sin in the middle, now you have to go to hell. And so there are some frightening scenes over here, right? So we have this bird devouring the human. We have, here's that close up. We have all these kind of strange creatures devouring a knight. We have this egg-shaped person that's I don't know, wearing a hat that has people on top. I don't, it's just strange. But this is one of those pieces you could totally diagnose and look at for hours and see something new every single time, right? Here's another Bosch. This is not the Garden of Earthly Delights, but you can kind of see his style, right? So the art of the North is basically a combination of two themes. It's going to be, we call it best of both worlds. So we have Consider the Nuts. So remember pieces like the Merode Altarpiece or the Arnolfini portrait were really small and textured. They had lots of detail. They had a lot of symbolism, and they were made out of oil paint. Those characteristics continue to exist in a later period. We often have a lot less disguised symbolism. The symbolism is a little bit more apparent and easier to read. And then we have the introduction of the style of the South. So places like Italy were influencing the North, and so we still have the positive mental attitude, the humanism component, and then perspective, modeling, and anatomy. So our next piece, why is the heading gone? Let's see. This is my direction a little bit. This is the Isenheim Altarpiece, number 77 by Grunewald. So this is a complex altarpiece as well. This was made in a region that kind of borders between contemporary Germany and France today. And it was actually made for a hospital chapel. And so the hospital chapel was known, or the hospital, I should say, was known for healing the sick, and in particular, healing people who had horrible skin conditions. Probably the best known one is called St. Elmo's Fire. From my childhood, there was a really bad movie made called St. Elmo's Fire. And St. Elmo's Fire was this disease was created by mold in rye. So something that they would use to make bread, there would be a mold that would grow in it, and people would make bread out of it and eat it. And it created this horrible skin condition that made their skin feel like it was on fire, and it would peel and blister and boil and be itchy and very uncomfortable. So a lot of the people who would come into this chapel would be having skin conditions. So I want you to keep in mind that when you look at some of the imagery, because I think you're going to see some symbols that help you understand that. So this is it in its closed form, or one of its open forms. So it's actually done in sculpture first. And then on the sides, we have a bunch of saints and hermits painted on the sides. So this is kind of the small chapel that it was painted for. So this gives you an idea of its location in the hospital chapel. Right? So this is the image that you guys have in the 250. And this is in one of its closed states. It actually opens up even more. So there's actually 3 different ways to see this. And it would be open and closed based on the church calendar. So this is a Catholic image. What's the theme of this side? So the part that you guys have in the 250, what is the theme of it? What's the subject matter here? Alana, can you help?
Is it Jesus on the cross?
Right. This is the crucifixion. So this is an image of the crucifixion. And so when we look at it close up, we have the crucifixion, we have the Virgin Mary and John. John was the disciple that Jesus had take care of her once he was gone. So John is often paired with Mary. And then we have an image of St. John the Baptist on the other side with his little lamb. And he's basically pointing at Jesus and saying, he's the reason, right? This over here on the wings is Saint Sebastian. And then on the right side, we have Saint Anthony. And then at the very bottom, right, it says it's the Lamentation, but it also looks like the Entombment, because can you see how they're placing the body of Jesus next to the tomb, right? So we have mourners, but then we also have his body. So the theme of this part is the price of sin. So Jesus is crucified for the sins of man, right? And so it shows you what is happening to his body. So let's take a close-up look. What's happening to Jesus' body because man is sinful? How would you describe his body? Eva, can you help?
It's kind of like deteriorating. He looks like he's really malnourished.
Exactly. He's emaciated. He has skin and bones, right? Skin and bones. And he is covered in lesions, right? What's a lesion? It's a sore. So his body is covered in sores. I think it's kind of hard to see here. And of course, that's a nod to the people who would be in this chapel, because they too would be suffering. Look at his hands. He's got those stakes in it, and then his hands are like, just like full of pain, right? He looks like he's dislocated his shoulder, right? It's got this very ambiguous sort of setting to it where there's like a spotlight on him and everything else is kind of dark. You know, spotlight on the people in the front, I should say, right? And then when we look at the body, so this is on that lintel part at the bottom. Here you can really see those sores. So once again, that's a connection with the function of this being in a chapel for patients who are suffering skin diseases and conditions. You know, so people with like severe psoriasis, you know, Sam fire, other skin conditions would be being treated here. And notice how this would be really close. So if I go back to this scene here, this would be the closest thing to the viewer, right? This would be like above the altar. So it would be kind of like right in their face that Jesus suffers alongside you, right? So notice how different it is than Southern painting. So this is the painting of Italy, early Renaissance. This is a very similar time period of the Northern Renaissance, right? What's the major difference? Think about Venice. It's made out of oil paint, right? It's made out of oil paint. So it has that kind of chiaroscuro, dramatic difference between light and dark. And it's got those darker, richer colors that's typical of oil. The South is more bright and luminous because of fresco, right? So here is the second opening, and this is a very different. What's the mood of this second opening? Isabella, what do you think?
It looks kind of like fantastical.
Yes, it's fantastical and joyous. So basically, this are joyful scenes based on the life of Jesus. And so we have the promise of resurrection is kind of like the theme of it all. But when we look at it in pieces, we have joyous scenes of Jesus's life. So we have the Annunciation. So Gabriel telling Mary she's pregnant. We have Mary and baby, right? So we have her, we have angels, a choir of angels. We have the resurrection. So look how joyful this is. He's like bursting out of the tomb, right? And then he's got this kind of like rainbow halo around him, right? So you can definitely see differences between the northern and the southern style of the same subject matter, right? Okay, so we're on to our last piece for today. We're making good progress, and I really am enjoying you guys' participation today. So a lot of northern pieces are inspired by Martin Luther. Why did Luther write the 95 Theses? Why did he do that? You guys remember? What did he do?
To write of the crimes and like the misdoings of the church.
Exactly. The church was wealthy, right? The church is wealthy, and he's a priest, and he understands that there are a lot of things that are just not written in scripture, that the Catholic Church has taken its own liberties, and it's granting indulgences, like you pay me enough money, you get to go to purgatory, or you get to get out of purgatory, you get to go straight to heaven, your sins are erased if you give me money. You know, saints have magical powers. People are like, how, where? I don't see that written in the Bible. And so people like Luther get excommunicated and break and start to establish this new Christianity. So in or before the Reformation, popes and cardinals lived like kings, right? More than they did spiritual leaders. When we talked about Julius II, we talked about how he commanded armies, right? They made political alliances, they made enemies, they waged war. They had nepotism, and they sold favors. And so in 1517, when Martin Luther wrote the Theses, he kind of started this Reformation. And so there were, you know, obviously the Vatican was trying to combat this, but we also have the Holy Roman Empire also trying to reform the church, but also to combat Protestantism as well, right? So we're going to be looking at humanism and classical tradition, right? So we don't have time for it. Of course, we can get through the artwork, but we don't have time for the online research. But we're going to look at Lucas Cranach's Allegory of Law and Grace, okay? And so we're going to be breaking it apart, right? So this is the image. We're going to be breaking it apart. Oops, I'm missing a slide here. Let me see if I skipped it in the PowerPoint. Oh, there it is. Sorry, I just didn't expect it. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so we have it in black and white form. So this is a print of a painting, and so I'll show you the painting in just a second. I think the Smart History article shows the painting, right? So here's the painting, okay? Now, when you have a painting, you have one. So Cranach, we have the invention of the printing press at this time. Cranach is really smart, and he prints numerous copies of this. And so he can spread the message of Martin Luther. All of those Martin Luther paintings that we saw were done by Cranach. Cranach knew Luther. He painted, like I said, numerous paintings of him, and was really aiding in the spread of this new form of Christianity brought on by the Reformation. So we're going to focus on the different parts of the image, right? So he made prints to spread the news, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to break down the image on how it's divided and what's on the right and what's on the left, okay? So what breaks up the composition into left and right? What's in the very center of this picture?
A tall tree.
A tall tree. And if you notice, on one side of the tree, there are leaves, and on the other side, it's barren. Symbolism. Woo, sorry. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at our left side. This is called the law side, right? What imagery tells us that this is not the way to salvation? This comes from the Old Testament. So the left side is based on the teachings of the Old Testament. And in the Old Testament, we have a skeleton and a demon forcing a frightened naked guy into hell. Right? And we have groups of prophets, right, including Moses, pointing towards the law. So we have the 10 Commandments right here in the image. So this is like the old belief is that if you just do good, you're going to get to go to heaven. And still, I think a lot of Christians today believe that. But in the Reformation, the emphasis was if you believe in Jesus, your sins are forgiven. And so they were trying to combat this kind of old law, right? So without the gospel, you're never going to get to heaven. So without Jesus, you're never going to get there. Because remember, the gospels are the stories of his life, right? So we have the flames of hell, right? We have Christ sitting in judgment in heaven. So there's Christ sitting over the world. And then we have Adam and Eve from the Old Testament. And they are the images of sin. Okay, so that's your left side. Make sure you get your content in. Okay. Oh, and then we have the dead tree, right? This is the old way. This is the way that does not lead to your salvation. So then on the other side, Cranach is going to say, these are the ways you get to heaven, right? So this is the gospel side. So the gospel side is the side of Jesus. So this is taken from the New Testament, so the new laws, right? We have John the Baptist directing a naked man, right, to the Christ's tomb. So showing him that this is the way. Through Jesus's death and resurrection, this is the way, right? So he shows the risen tomb, or Christ from the risen tomb, I should say, right? And we have the man standing passively, right? His hands are clasped, right? So he's submitting himself to God's mercy. On the crucifix, notice the crucifix at the top. There is the Holy Spirit here, but there's blood squirting at the man. Very direct, right? To show the forgiveness of his sins. And then here we have a living tree rather than a dead tree, right? In the background, we have a serpent and we have the Israelites. That's actually really interesting. This is an Old Testament image that on the painting is on the other side, but on the print, he swapped the sides for some reason. And that's there to represent the 40 years of wandering by the Israelites after they flee in Egypt, right? So here you can see the painting, right? So you can see a little bit more of that imagery. And he paired it with scripture at the bottom. So there's some writing included in this too, right? So here's some other examples of Cranach. Like, what the heck is that guy doing on horseback in front of the crucifixion? Just strange, right? Totally feels Mannerist in a way. Here's his version of a nude. And then last people in the north, this is Hans Holbein. So here we have Henry VIII, right? It was done in a style very similar to the painting of Francis I, right? And this is probably the best known Holbein. This is the ambassadors. And so we have two cousins who are basically showing off their humanist knowledge, right? So we have all these implements of math and science. And this thing at the very bottom is a skull. And so if you look at it from the side or use a rounded tube that's like mirrored, you actually see the skull come together. Holbein in German means hollow bone. And so people often think this might be his signature, or it could be a symbol that even with all this earthly knowledge, you're gonna die. Isn't that a bright thought for today? I feel like we have to end there. There's a Holbein. This was Mantegna, who we didn't talk about. Okay, we're done for today. So enjoy the rest of your day. Make sure that you help your parents shovel. Okay. If you have any questions on your way out, let me know. Bye, everyone. Okay. So we me to clean your area. So some teachers are doing it themselves. Personally, you're old enough to do it yourself. So I'm going to show you, and then you'll do it. Because at least in this room, we have water and soap. So you are welcome to wash your hands. I would not hand sanitize after this and get it off my skin. Okay? So anything that you touch, like if you didn't go over here, I think you're safe. You just want to do this in your chair and let it sit for a minute. And then you're gonna wipe it off with that. And then let's leave it right there when you're done. And then wash it. Okay? I actually have to clean too. Right? This is the only period I'm in this room